got 3 daughters. So who's the 4th child?
So they're all homeschooling and
yeah, and it's working pretty well for them.
Okay.
They've all got video lessons, and the youngest, Eleanor, who's 10, she the structure for her day is she gets like a 15-minute video call with her class and with her teacher. The teacher explains something and gives them a task to do, and then they have half an hour to do it. And then they've got another call for the next bit. So we don't have to do very much at all. It's such a relief compared to last time when we just had like a list of things for her to do, and every time we said, so the next thing's this, she would say,
Good evening. Welcome to this evening's discussion on church and atheism. And pleased again to join to be with Steve Jones from Oxford Community Church. He's a senior leader there, and he's also a leader of a group of churches where he leads 20 other churches. And we're so happy to have you, Steve. Thank you for just carving out time both last Sunday and this evening just to help us understand more about why people, choose to not believe in God. Steve was with us on Sunday when he introduced this and gave us a wonderful introduction about why people, struggle to believe in God. And there were a couple of things for me, Steve, that really stood out from what you shared. First of all, that actually there's a contradiction where you have 50% of people, 52% of the population saying that they have no faith, but actually 50% of the population believing in life after death. So that was interesting. And does that come from just, it's actually people hoping that there's something else after?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to listen to people describing what they think happens. And there's loads of people believe in angels. That's really popular. I mean, if you look in bookshops, if you're ever in a bookshop and you look at what's on the shelves and you see what's selling, there's not often lots of really solid Christian teaching being sold in bookshops, but there's things about angels and spirit guides, and it's not that there's half the population has some sort of orthodox Christian belief about life after death, but there is this sense that there's more to life than just what we have here. And one of the things that we'll look at in just a minute is the desire that people have, lots of British people have, to have a coherent view of the world, like it all makes sense. At the same time, very few people have a really coherent view of the world. They might believe in little bits of this religion or that worldview or this little thing they picked up off a Disney film once. And that's humanity for us, isn't it? We all face that challenge.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I felt you probably would be one of the best people when you responded to the email saying I would love to do this, is because I know that you're a scientist and you've got a scientific background, but also B, you're Christian leader. Have been a Christian, are involved in senior Christian leadership. So kind of these two things, you are able to sort of interact in both worlds and understand the arguments. So I think we're really so fortunate to have you, Steve. So this evening you are just going to let you loose. What you were saying you want to help us understand is just about evolution and rationalism. So two other things that sort of hinder people from engaging in faith. So, take it away. It's all yours, and I'll interrupt you if I need to. But take it away.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we'll come to evolution afterwards, because what I want to try to do is to explain something that I think is a little bit challenging to explain around. I've used the word rationalism, and I just want to make sure there's time for anybody to come back with comments or Gitao or Jackie, if you wanted to ask me to make sure I've been clear on this, because it's a story really that goes back 400 years to the beginnings of what came to be known as science. And there was a really strong drive that arose in Europe 400 or so years ago to really want to make sense of the world, rather than just receive teaching about what it's like. I think that followed on from the Reformation. We've just been celebrating the last few years, 500 years since Martin Luther challenged the existing Christian teaching. And in the years that followed, people began to think differently, and they began to think, gosh, if we've had 1,000 years of just the bishops and the church telling us what to believe, and here's someone who's had a revelation and made sense of things in a new way, what else is there that we need to make sense of? What the world that we live in and the way that it works and who we are as people, what else is there to make sense of? And as people ask that question, they found really two foundations that they were increasingly confident to stand on, and those were reason, from which the word rationalism comes, wanting to be rational, and on the other hand, science or scientific method. And I'll just explain those two things. The thing about reason was that people felt, well, if you can be logical and say, if A is the case and B is the case, then C must be the case, then you can build up something that you're more confident about. And if someone says something to you that makes no sense, then it's appropriate for you to say, that is nonsense. It's not making sense to me. And so there was this development of rational philosophy that was willing to sort of put the pin in the bubble of anything that they couldn't quite make sense of. And there was quite a bit in Christian teaching that we have received and it remains a little bit mysterious to us. I mean, I'm sure you'd think of some things for yourself, but the fact that Jesus calls his disciples and says, follow me, like they have a choice. And then we read later in the New Testament that all of God's saints have been predestined. Or the Trinity, and how is God 3 in 1? And so there are aspects of the Christian revelation that remain somewhat mysterious to us. This rationalistic attitude said, if it doesn't make sense, then it's nonsense. So that took off, and that was really a determination to rely on logic rather than feelings. And the driver behind that was, well, there were a couple of different drivers. One was that some people just loved putting a pin in the bubble of the pompous bishops. They just, they loved doing that. Another driver in it, though, was the conviction that it was a more solid place to stand, that being logical was a more solid place to stand than being emotional or being mystical. The other thing so that's all the rationalistic bit. The other thing that was happening at the same time was the development of scientific method. And the thing about scientific method is the idea that if you can repeat something lots of times and see the same thing happening every time, then you can be confident about the way that thing works. And so scientific method depends on experiments. You have this carefully constrained, orchestrated situation that you put together in your experiment, and then you repeat it lots of times over, and you discover what is predictable about the way things work together. And that also has with it the sense of reliability. Like, it might only be that I've just worked out how long a cockroach lives, to pull out one fact that you asked me on Sunday morning, but at least it's something solid. Like, give me any cockroach living out its days, and there's some kind of predictability to it. And so what that rationalistic thing enjoyed poking as I say, in the bubble of the church authorities, where the church authorities had been overbearing and domineering. People were really motivated to be logical instead, and also to base their beliefs in this kind of scientific basis. So it gives us an alternative, a valid, solid, predictable kind of alternative to relying on revelation and teaching and the prophetic and all that mystical, spiritual stuff. And I think you see that really clearly in some ways that the English language is used today. So we talk about the physical world and the spiritual world as like two different things. They're kind of oil and water, like, they're different from each other. And when we think about the physical world, the kind of the things that are associated with that in Western thinking are the physical world is something that is routine and reliable. We think about there being laws of nature, and therefore you can predict what it's going to do, and that takes away your anxiety about the future. It makes sense to us. It feels like there are really solid facts there, and that's all quite comforting, really. And that would be contrasted with the spiritual world, which is supernatural, it's mysterious, it's mystical, it's about our feelings, it's unpredictable. Well, at least here. But yeah, people think, well, I inject a vaccine, and I've got a really high likelihood of knowing what will happen to me. I pray a prayer to be defended against the vaccine. Well, maybe it will be God's will to protect me, and maybe He's got some other plan I don't quite understand. So the material world is just more predictable, and you know where you're at with it. And the spiritual world can feel anxious. And so what's developed really in Western culture is this sense that the physical world is good and trustworthy and something we can all talk about and agree upon, like this is the way it is. And the spiritual world is something all a little bit opaque, a little bit hard to see, about which we're not going to agree. And that flows through then into people's attitudes towards believing God, specifically. That is it. When I asked on social media last week, my friends, why are people atheists? I had one atheist friend who responded saying, basically, you Christians haven't made your case clearly enough. And what he was saying was, the idea that God exists is a really big idea. To be confident in that, you'd have to run some really big experiment, and it would have to be really watertight logically in order to be confident in it. It's a really big thing, really big concept, requires a really big body of hard evidence, and it requires really tight logic. And you Christians have not provided that. So that can be quite intimidating. Because it's like raising a really high bar for us.
Yeah.
No, you're right. I haven't done experiments, and goodness me, and it makes me think. Some of my initial reaction would be, I'm sure that someone did some research somewhere on hospitals where people get prayed for and hospitals where people don't get prayed for, and I'm sure there's some evidence, like scientific evidence, that prayer does work. But actually, the belief in God as the one who's behind everything is such a big belief that, one or two studies on prayer for healing in hospitals are still probably not going to reach that high bar of proof, as it were, of making it a fact that God is there and that he cares for all of us. So, it's
just to ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
Sorry, and this might, whether it takes away. So when you were talking about that, are there instances where people have got small experiments and set up small experiments?
Yeah.
And they get some results, but then that small experiment, if it's done on a wider scale, doesn't achieve those same results?
That can happen, yeah. Yeah. So certainly in medicine, there's a whole branch of medicine which they call doing meta studies, where someone who's a really good statistician collects all of the actual detailed data from lots of different studies and looks at it all together and says, because some studies this medicine worked and some studies it didn't work so well, and tries to make sense of all of that. And sometimes people, but the thing about the scientific process is when you write up your report, your paper on what's happened, you don't just report what happened, you report a sort of really detailed log of all the things that you did. Like how warm your laboratory was, all these different things. So that someone's got a good chance of repeating it. And obviously it's brilliant when you hear the news that someone else in some other part of the world has found the same thing. And if they don't, then it sets you thinking afresh as to what's going on. What scientists would say is they're not intimidated by the idea of another experiment coming up with a different result, because they want to find out how it all really works. And if someone's come up with something else, well, then that's more information. So great.
Okay.
In practice, if you do an experiment and you publish a result and you're really pleased that you've seen something, and someone produces something else that disagrees with it, that is pretty gutting. At a personal level, it is, but at the level of discovering things, people then sort of get over that feeling of personal, like, and step on to, well, let's try and work it out then. Let's work out what's really going on.
Okay.
Often when people have got a really clear view of things, and they might challenge us on whether we are able to meet their criteria, this thing can rise up in us that we want to prove ourselves. We don't want to be thought of as, what's the opposite of rational? Irrational. That doesn't sound like a good thing to be. And we don't want, if they're scientific, we don't want to be, what's the opposite of scientific? Superstitious, probably. We don't want to be irrational and superstitious. So we're like, come on, let's try and say something sensible here. But unless you have science as your profession or philosophy as your profession, it's probably too high a hill to climb, frankly. in the book of Proverbs, there's a place where it says, I think it's chapter 26, I think it is, where it says, there's two verses straight after each other. One says, answer a fool according to his folly. And the next verse says, don't answer a fool according to his folly. The other way around, maybe. And it says, if you read the second half of each verse, one says, don't answer a fool according to his folly, or else he'll be wise in his own eyes.
Yes.
And the other one says, answer a fool according to his folly, or else, I can't remember. Do you know what? I wasn't expecting to quote this. I haven't got it. I haven't got the exact words in my mind. But the point is, it's saying sometimes if you answer someone according to what they're saying and you speak on their terms, sometimes that's brilliant because you can really refute them or clarify things. Sometimes if you get drawn onto their ground, all you do is confirm them in the fact that this is a good way to be talking.
Yeah.
And I think in this area, especially if people have got some education in a particular area and they're making a point about, I don't know, the evolution of human behavior or something, it's probably best not to get drawn into that. But that doesn't mean we've got nothing to say. What it can be hugely helpful to do is to follow Jesus' example of asking questions. And if what someone's saying doesn't quite make sense to you, it's a really humble, but also a really powerful thing to say, it doesn't quite make sense to me what you're saying.
Yes.
And it might be that in that conversation, you're pressing in and saying, yeah, can you explain to me? I don't understand why, if you believe that, you also believe that. It might be that works really well, just as friendship, for you to understand more of what they feel. They'll feel dignified that you're listening to them. You're not losing anything by doing that. But it may just be that you come across one of those points of genuine, incoherence in what they're saying. That actually they began the conversation by saying, look, I've got this coherent view of the world and you Christians are irrational and superstitious. But actually, when you start to probe it, actually there's some things that don't hold together in their whole view of the world as well. And I think it both fosters friendship, but also can be really helpful in clarifying matters. And we don't have to defend ourselves, but you can inquire as to what someone else is really saying. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
And some of the things that might come up in conversation is if we'll come to evolution in a minute, but if someone's saying, we're all just animals that evolved, you might find yourself saying, I'm a bit surprised. Would you be telling your wife that she's an animal?
Yeah.
Would you be telling your children that your love for them is merely a hormonal thing and has no real meaning? Is that what you're saying? Those are the kinds of questions that I think it can be really helpful to ask. And it may be that they say, I find it keeps me awake at night, but honestly, that is what I believe. Or they might say, oh, don't be ridiculous. I never meant that. But that's a really good way to get at that matter.
Another question I've got, Steve, is so some people will say that that science is happy with uncertainty. So science is happy to admit that there are things that they don't know and they're still trying to find out. And that therefore doesn't dispute or disqualify some of the wide claims that they would make. So how do you deal with people raising that argument?
I love there's a phrase which is I find so helpful, which is that every answer is the father of a whole new family of questions.
Okay.
And what happens often when we're young is we've got this little list of questions that we think are important about life, and we have this idea that we'll gradually work our way through them as we go through our adult lives, and we'll gradually work the questions down to the point where everything makes sense to us. But it doesn't work that way,
Mm.
because we get an answer to one thing and it just like it opens up a whole new horizon for us. And we go, oh, okay. And what actually happens is it's not that we get more answers and the number of questions reduces. It's like we get more answers and the number of questions just, grows even more.
Yeah.
And I think we can be honest about that as Christians. There's a hymn that we've sometimes sung, I don't know if you ever do, which has got this repeated pair of phrases. I cannot tell, it says, but this I know. I cannot tell why he whom angels worship should set his love upon something. But this I know, he heals the brokenhearted. And we should be able to hold together. These are things that I know are true. And here's a bunch of questions that I have. The fact that I have questions that might even bother me quite a bit, some of those questions, they don't need to bleed back into the things that I know and make me uncertain of those things. It's possible for me to know some things and have some questions about things as a Christian. And then we're just in the same place as that scientist that you're talking about. He says, well, we've worked some things out. There's some things we don't know. Actually, it's possible that I'll discover some other answer in the future, which will cause me to revise what the answer that I was holding on to before. That's all okay, because we're growing in our knowledge and understanding throughout our lives. It is possible to hold together both a real confidence in some things that we know and an openness still to be learning. Is that what you're driving at?
So I think I think what you're saying is that that in itself, from a scientific position, that in itself, that is something we as well, people of faith, can lay claim to and say, yeah, and that doesn't weaken our faith position.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, somebody might say to me, to try to make the matter really sharp, I can imagine an unbeliever saying to me, so Steve, what experiment could be done that would, like, if it had a certain result, would prove to you that God doesn't exist? It's an interesting question to mull for ourselves. It's probably not the most edifying question to ask. What are all the things I could imagine that would undermine my faith? But I do. It does prompt me to say what I want is I want to keep searching after the truth, and what I shouldn't do is be fearful of people's questions. Actually, if I really believe that God is sustaining me, if I really believe that the Holy Spirit's with me, guiding me into all truth, I don't need to be afraid of questions that people ask. I can allow them in. I can allow the questions in, and let them touch my heart, let them change my thinking if they need to, and still trust God to lead me forward in that. And I think that attitude wins a lot of respect, actually. Should we talk about evolution?
Yeah. Well, there was a question it's just coming and it's disappeared, because you were talking about science and now it's gone. If I get it, yeah, let's talk about evolution.
So I don't know.
I've got it. So why is it that in terms of sort of rational people, why is personal experience dismissed in terms of faith? So if you give your personal account, say, so if you talk of people in the Middle East who have this sort of very vivid experiences of meeting Christ, and that for them is a profound experience that changes their view completely. You could talk of people who pray and they get miraculously healed. and that completely changes their view. Why is still that not enough for some people? You know, if
Yes,
if
I think there's a in some people at least, and I think it's quite widespread in British culture. There's a fairly deep-seated distrust of people's personal testimony, which comes from I talked earlier about the physical world, the spiritual world, that which is solid and factual, that which is mystical. Another pair of words that could be put on top of that would be the words objective and subjective.
Yeah.
So if I have an objective view of things, it means it's not about my personal interests. It's not about what I want.
Yeah.
It's something I've observed and seen.
Yeah.
And you can rely on me as a witness because I am personally disinterested. I am a good witness because I have no motive for saying anything else. A subjective perspective is one that is all about how I particularly see it. This is my perspective on the world. This is my experience. This is what I would like. This is how things make sense to me. And that sort of testimony is not viewed as having. It might be interesting. I might be inspired by it, but it's not got the same kind of weight. It's seen, I think, a bit like, a criminal. This is probably not quite the best imagery, but maybe it will help. Some criminal is in court, and their friend is called to testify for them. You think, hang on a minute, this is their friend testifying. They've got an angle here, and I will judge things accordingly. I think it's quite typical for any kind of testimony about spiritual experience to be sort of discounted because, well, the experience did you a load of good and you really enjoyed having it. You really enjoyed that spiritual experience. Of course you're going to be positive about it.
Okay. So, yeah. Okay, carry on then. Let's move on to evolution.
So about 10 years ago, there was a survey done of Christians in the UK and their attitude to creation and evolution. And here's a few statements that people were asked to say, do you believe this or not? This is, bearing in mind, this is questions being asked of Christians. So the statement, God created people in the last 10,000 years. How many Christians in the UK would say God created people in the last 10,000 years? The answer 10 years ago was 17%, 17. Asked what they thought about the statement, humans probably evolved. 65% of Christians in the UK agreed with that statement. Asked about the statement, God used evolution to create humans. 44% could see God at work creating people through evolution. Which is to say that if you ask the questions of people, the majority of people are not in those kind of two extreme camps of God did it all in 6 24-hour periods less than 10,000 years ago, nor in the camp of, well, it all just kind of happened and God's not involved. Most people are sort of reaching for something in between those two, which accepts the fact that evolution does occur, whilst also seeing that God is creator. In terms of people watching or listening into this call, I don't know whether that will be a surprise or that just makes a lot of sense immediately. Do you know what? I've misled you slightly. I'm looking at my wrong set of data. The things that I just said about the 17% and the humans, that was actually not for Christians. That was for the British population as a whole.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry about that. But in which case, the fact that only 2/3 of people think humans evolved is quite striking.
Yeah.
If you come to the data for Christians in particular, and you offer Christians 3 options about Genesis, the 3 options being the world was created in 6 24-hour days, option 1. Option 2, the world was created in 6 periods of time, but each period of time was a whole geological period. So, and the third option being that the Genesis creation account is symbolic, meaning that we don't have to worry about how it maps into time. Then the answers to those 3 is roughly thirds. Roughly a third of British Christians would say the world was created in 6 24-hour periods. Roughly a third would say in chunks of 6 days, but just over millions of years. And roughly a third would say it's symbolic. So what I thought would be helpful to say is actually, there's problems with all of those views. And I don't mean problems in the sense of some are more scientific, some are more biblical, but just thinking biblically, just thinking theologically, there are some biblical problems with all of those different views. And I just thought it might be helpful to name a few of those. So there are biblical problems with the idea that things evolve, that everything evolved. That's probably a fairly obvious thing to say. But suppose you were really wanting to take it symbolically and say, no, look, come on, it could be symbolic. Lots of the Bible's symbolic. Why can't it be symbolic? You still have some really meaty problems. One of which would be that the New Testament talks about Adam as a historical figure. So that you've got to somehow, what do you do with that? There's another problem theologically, which is that if you believe that things evolved prior to the fall happening, then you've got death happening before the fall. So that's not the way the Bible presents things. Now, there can be answers to those questions. So the answer to the question about death before the fall would be to say there was no human death before the fall, and that animal death isn't a moral problem. And on the matter of Adam being a historical figure, you would be really driven to saying something like God used the process of evolution to evolve our physical bodies, and then at some point in more recent history placed his spirit upon some particular creatures, and that distinction turned those creatures into being fully human. So taking the second creation account in Genesis, you would be driven to saying something like, where it says God formed Adam out of the dust of the earth, that is code for saying there was this really long evolution of Adam's physical body. And then where it says God breathed his spirit, and that's a moment in history.
So this is, would I be right in saying this is us trying to have a rational explanation of what Genesis 1 to 11 is about?
So these are some of the things that people would, have written books about and tried to make sense of it, because they see that as, whether you look at the fossil record or in fact the fact that new species are appearing in the world, all the time. Trying to make sense of that together with Genesis. On the other hand, just take the other point, if we were to stick with 6-day creation, there are some problems with that as well, some biblical problems with that. I don't mean scientific problems. The biblical problems would include, what on earth does it mean for there to be days in Genesis 1 before the sun was created? Or to note the fact that there are 2 creation accounts and that they contradict each other in their order. So Genesis 1 starts with there being water everywhere, and then God creates dry land. Whereas in Genesis 2, there is dry land, which then is watered. In Genesis 1, plants and animals are created before people, but in Genesis 2, Adam's created before it then says that God put plants in the earth. Now, again, people have written books trying to square those circles and make sense of them. All I'm wanting to say is that we could all do with approaching the whole matter with a degree of humility, and noting that none of us have got it all completely explained.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know how people feel about that, whether it feels important to have it all, it all neatly explained or not.
I think the challenge is how we approach the text, isn't it? We approach it with a scientific, rational mind, that A plus B has to give us a conclusion of C. And therefore, when we apply that to this text and it doesn't give us that conclusion, we then dismiss the whole book, the entire sort of foundation for faith, because
Yes,
people feel that we've been able to not come to a conclusion that A plus B equals C, so therefore nothing else will hold, nothing else can hold. So I think you'd have to shout louder.
Also, I think maybe when we read that story and we acknowledge it's God's revelation to people, and human beings get a story and they pass it on. And if you've ever had stories or stories passed, you do acknowledge sometimes, there'll be a difference. She missed that bit out. She added that thing, but it doesn't discount that the event didn't happen. It just, when Jackie was telling me, she was saying it so quickly, she didn't actually mention the color of his shoes or did he wash his hands fast, that sort of thing. So I think maybe either for some of us or from the cultures some of us come from, where we appreciate the art of oral storytelling and we acknowledge stories get passed on, you will accept that the event happened and the story has been told, and maybe this writer mentioned it like this or mentioned it like this, but it does not still discount that the event happened.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think what that pushes, agreeing with you there, what that pushes us towards, I think, is it's actually not unlike that thing I was saying a few minutes ago about having solid convictions and some questions. I think that's where it takes us. It's saying, there are some things that I know because I've read them in Genesis, and there are some things that I have questions about in Genesis. Like I don't know why things are in a different order in the two stories. I don't know why that's the case. I don't really understand the moral status of death of animals. I don't know what the answer to that question is. There are some questions that reading the text raises. I just don't know the answers. But there are definitely some things that I can know. I can know that God created all things. I can know that the world, the physical world, is good because God made it good. I can know that the sun is not a god to be worshipped. It would have been a live question in the ancient world, but that it's made by God to serve us. I can know that the spiritual world is not made up of lots of competing gods having a battle in the cosmos, but there is one God who is creator of all. And I can know that we are made in his image. Like there's so much there that I can know. And it's a real shame, in my view, that Christians have often ended up arguing over the specifics of, but can we know about the length of time? Which we will, Christians, I think, will continue to disagree over.
Yes.
when there's loads that we could agree that we don't know. So let's all agree we don't know that. We don't know why there's a difference in order between Genesis 1. We can all agree we don't know why there's a difference in order. And we can all agree that God is creator, and we can all agree that he made a good world, and we can all agree that we're made in his image. And sadly, much of the discussion between Christians has been over this, the few bits really that we find we don't know, we can't all agree on which side is that our conviction, or is that still a question. And I think we do well to find that place of both conviction and humility.
Yeah.
Some people then would argue that people would challenge people who believe in evolution by saying, well, the Earth couldn't have possibly just started with a bang. There must be something that led that, and that must have been God.
Yeah.
And then people on that side push back and say, well, God couldn't have come out of what caused God.
Yeah, who made God? Yes.
Yeah. So how do you reconcile those arguments? How do you deal with an argument like that?
Yeah, well, I think the most common thing I would say would be that I'm trying to think about how to say this concisely. I was saying a minute ago about often it's good to ask questions rather than to feel like you've got to explain everything, like you're the guru that knows everything. I would find myself agreeing at a philosophical level that what you just said about if God made the world, who made God? Like that's a pretty fair argument, I think. And so I'm not going to take that one on. There is a really carefully reasoned philosophical argument that says that God, because of the nature of who God is as all powerful and all knowing, it's more logical that he should be the beginning of all things than that any other kind of entity should be the beginning of all things. And I've read those philosophical arguments, and I think they're pretty solid, but my chances of getting them into a conversation over a cup of tea with people and doing them justice are pretty thin. So I wouldn't try to go there. Equally, I wouldn't try to argue against evolution. I'd actually go to there's a period of time in between those two things, which is actually where the real problems lie for our atheist friends. Because once you've got the first bacterium, it's actually quite straightforward for us to imagine how the first bacterium forms a population of bacteria out of which the first more complex cell, a eukaryotic cell, emerges, and then how those join together into sponge-like creatures, which then become something called tunicates, which have got their immature stage has got something a little bit like the beginning of a nerve cord in them, which could become a backbone. Like once you've got a bacterium, you can actually see incredible continuity all the way through to really advanced animals and plants. The biggest issue for our atheist friends is, where did that bacterium come from? That's actually a bigger problem than the fact that the whole universe kicked off with a bang, because we'll argue over that and how that started. We don't really know. And it's more of a problem than the fact that advanced animals are really amazing and that people are really amazing. It's like to get from a soup of chemicals to that first functioning, most basic cell is just an astonishing leap that no one at all has imagined how that happened. And seriously, scientists are like the idea, some scientists, atheistic scientists, like the idea that those bacteria came to Earth from somewhere else. And there's a reason they like the idea, is because on the standard scientific model, The universe is about 13 billion years old. Our Earth, our planet, is only about 4 billion years old. And if you allow for the fact that those first bacteria came like on a meteor or something, it gives you another 10 billion years to imagine.
Yes.
But the fact that people are attracted by that idea, I think, just underlines how very, very unimaginable it is to us to see how the first bacteria happened. I have found it in the sort of conversations I've had with scientists that botanists and zoologists generally are very, very positive about evolution explaining the whole of life. But if you talk to biochemists who look at what would have been in that soup of chemicals and who know what complex chemicals fit together to make cells and know how complicated cells are, they look at you if you're a little bit crazy to think that just somehow all came together.
So it's almost like they would rather acknowledge that something came from out of Earth and fell here to create life than to say there is a God who is above all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is the straight up truth. Yeah.
And also the other thing you said was that it's not an unreasonable position to have, that if we believe in the existence of an all-knowing, all-powerful God, it's not an unreasonable position to say, therefore, he was there before everything started.
Yes. Yeah, and I suppose just to rehearse that argument, I will try to do it justice. The argument is basically that anything that has been created, that the creator of that thing must by definition be greater than the thing they created.
Yeah.
And so given that the definition of God as supreme being is that he has all power and all knowledge, it is not reasonable to ask who made that, because then you're imagining someone greater. And if your definition is that God is the greatest, that's like the definition of God, then by definition he cannot have a creator, because his creator would have to be greater than him. And we've chosen a definition of God, which is that there is no greater one.
So
I mean, it's a bit of a fine philosophical argument, which is not likely to persuade anyone to change their lifestyle.
But if you try and take the two comments you've made, so if we take that position and bring it into the science debate that you brought in just now, biochemists versus biologists, biochemists will be comfortable, and this is, I'm not speaking for them, that would be the philosophical discussion you've made now would be comfortable. They wouldn't have a problem with that, because the question they've got to answer is, where did that little cell, that first bacterium, as you call it, the soup of chemicals, where did that, what brought that into existence?
Yes. And I think it cycles back again to this thing that keeps emerging in our conversation, which is there are some things we can know and there are some things that we do not know. And we, being mature adult thinkers, demands that we accept the fact that there are some things we really do know and some things we really don't know. And what do we do with the balance of those things? So it may be that our biochemist friends say, I just don't know. I mean, I don't know if I can't make sense of this. But they may choose to say, since I can't make sense of this, I think there must be a God. Or they may say, well, we can't make sense of this at the moment, but maybe some future generation of scientists will. And I think it then brings us back to what I was saying on Sunday morning about the fact there's all kinds of reasons why people make their decisions to believe or not to believe. A biochemist who went to school went to church as a child and was abused by their youth leader and has given up on their faith, faced with the question of where the first bacterium came from, might be might tend to say, oh, let's leave it to a future generation of scientists, I can still live without God. Whereas some other biochemist whose Christian colleague had recently prayed for them in some and seen an answer to prayer, faced with the question of where the first bacterium came from, they say, you know, just maybe these things add up together, and the one who answered that prayer is real, and I should make steps towards this Christian faith.
So what I hear you saying, Steve, is that actually the culture and the context that we create for people, whether it's our children, whether it's in the society, whether it's people we work with, that has a huge impact on how they view God and whether it's worth exploring.
Yes, and I think I want to say specifically that having commended the idea of having some things we're really sure about and being open about the fact there are some things we don't know, actually both each of those things alone is pretty unattractive. So on the one hand, saying being kind of really confused Christian that says, well, I don't know anything really, you know, it's all very complicated. That's not going to help anybody discover faith. But equally, being the kind of Christian that just always knows the answers, which may be more of a temptation to feel like you're supposed to have answers, right? I mean, we're supposed to be Christ's light in the world. Doesn't that mean we can bring revelation and truth and so on? But the pressure to feel like we've got to speak like we've always got the answer, even when we don't, actually, particularly talking about Western culture, that way of being like, well, I know all the answers, come on, I've got convictions, that enthusiasm for faith can actually be really off-putting because it just doesn't feel honest.
How would you deal with people then who challenge the Bible as a whole? Now, you know, we've talked about creation story and tried to tease out how it can be viewed. But just how can you help us deal with people who dismiss the whole Bible and say, you know, this was just mythical, none of it is true?
Yeah.
You know, people who would say, you know, how can we be sure Jesus was a historical person?
Yeah. My goal would not be trying to win the argument about the history of the Bible. My goal will be to get them reading the Bible. So rather than having an argument about, you know, the archaeological evidence in favor of, you know, the Exodus or something, I would say, well, look, clearly the Bible has been found profoundly helpful and valuable by generations and generations of people. So before dismissing it wholesale, we ought to recognize it's a pretty arrogant thing.
Okay, yeah.
Saying, you know, away with all of it.
Yes.
And I think, actually, here's a point at which, if you're blessed to come from a non-white British background, you've got an advantage. Because if someone who's not white British says to me, white British person, you're being culturally arrogant, dismissing other cultures, then we're like, oh no. I'm sorry about the empire. No, that's not us.
Yeah.
And I think to accuse people who want to throw it all out of being culturally arrogant when there are many generations and many people around the world who find the Bible supremely helpful, I say, rather than just dismissing it all, maybe recognize that people have found it. You know, do you know what? Something that people most often find helpful is reading one of the Gospels. Why don't you actually read one of the Gospels, and then we can have a conversation about it, about what it does to people, rather than just about the history. And that was obviously sidestepping the question of the history. But I think, as with evolution, questions about the history of the Bible, they're usually like smoke screens.
Yes.
Really, they're not usually the questions that are holding people back from faith. They're not usually the things that make people doubt God. They're red herrings, that's the phrase, isn't it? They're ways of avoiding having the real discussion about my heart.
Have you ever had opportunities where people come to you and say, I used to be a Christian, I'm now not a Christian, and do they engage in a conversation with you? Or
I had a phone call just before Christmas from one of the colleges that I was at in Oxford University as a student. And they phone you up every year to ask for money, like they haven't got enough.
Yeah.
I always say, you've got enough money. Anyway, the phone call this year comes from one of the students who was an Eastern European girl who said, I'd grown up in church and I've given up on it and become an atheist because of things. The conversation came up because she said, what do you do now? I said, well, I used to be a scientist and I'm now a pastor. And there was this pause in the conversation. And she said, would it be all right if we talked about that rather than about the money that I'm supposed to be talking to you about? And we had a whole conversation around, so look into it for yourself. There's loads of Christians that are scientists, and there's loads of ways of making, that people have continued in their faith. And, you really don't need to see those things being in two different boxes. And at the end of the conversation, she was like, I'm so glad we could have talked about this. People have often been told that just like, the physical world and the spiritual world are seen as being like oil and water. They're told that, being an intellectual and being analytical, particularly, and being a believer are different things. And that's why I think it's wonderful when Christians who have a strong faith are also open to asking questions and allowing the analysis to take place, because it encourages people in. So you don't have to throw all your questions out before you can come in the door. This Christian community where we do believe is also a place where we ask honest questions. You're welcome to come in with your questions. We're not intimidated by those questions. We might not have answers to them, but that's all right, because we've got some things we know are true, and we're still learning.
Yeah, I think what you're really encouraging us is to avoid getting into an argument where we think we can give all the answers.
Yes,
would better serve others if we listen and sort of get their points of view and understand where they're coming from. And I think you laid that foundation on Sunday, saying there could be very many reasons why people have come to this position, and actually it's worth listening rather than thinking, because the temptation, as you say, is easy just to try and spew off answers. I remember a certain young chap who started coming to a church plant, and I can't remember whether I spoke or shared from I preached about Lot's message and that story, and he sort of pulled me aside and said, you don't believe that stuff is true. Now, again, I remember that as clear as day, and I struggled about how to answer him. I didn't know where he was coming from. And I think whichever answer I gave him probably didn't help him, because I fell into the trap of trying to explain. And I could, if I'm honest, when I was preparing, I couldn't say that I was thinking about the historicity of it. So
I think stories like that are really helpful, because whenever you get someone to come in and talk about I've come and joined you to talk about this. You've asked me to talk about this because you think I'll be particularly clear and eloquent on it. Well, I hope I've been a little bit like that, but there's a danger that goes along with that, is that everybody feels like this ought to be their area of expertise, that they can just talk about. The reason that I'm able to talk about it with some ease is because I've had loads of these conversations. And it's a bit like if you start trying to speak a new language, And the first time you open your mouth to try to talk in that new language, you know that you're not really representing yourself at your best. And you feel awful about it. And you think, oh, what are they going to think of me? I used the wrong word and whatever. But you'll never become fluent in that other language unless you push through that. So I would encourage everyone to relax, accept the fact that you're going to look like an idiot sometimes. Like welcome to the Christian faith. God doesn't promise that we'll always look brilliant. But when we offer ourselves to serve him and we take risks, then amazing things happen.
And my final question to you, Steve, is: have you had, two questions? So, and I don't know whether I'll give you enough time to think about this. Clearly, and because as soon as I finish, I would be expecting an answer. So I'll start with the difficult one and then the easier one. So it's not difficult. You probably have an answer for it anyway. Just to give us an example of somebody who you've met who's had very sort of strong beliefs, atheistic beliefs, and after a conversation, you can see you've won them over. Either A, they became Christians, or actually B, they may have seen actually what you say makes a lot of sense, and this is more food for thought. And then the other question is, any layman's books that you can point us towards would be grateful.
Okay. So on the first one, I don't know anybody who's gone from atheism to follower of Christ in one conversation, or anyone where I have been the person that has done every step with them. But I know quite a few people who have taken that journey.
Yes.
Probably the most encouraging one to note is actually someone else who was one of my lecturers in Oxford University in the Department of Zoology with all of the atheists that were there. And he was an ornithologist, so studying birds. And I mentioned on Sunday morning that someone had been such a help to me, Jeremy Blakey, who was another lecturer in the Department of Zoology. And the two of them were doing field work on an island off the coast of Britain, and there was the sun set, and this other guy who wasn't a believer looked at it and said, that doesn't just make sense physically. There's something else there. And then over the time that followed, they had various conversations. This guy started attending church. Anyway, he's now an ordained Anglican vicar.
Oh, wow.
So those journeys do take place. There's a young woman in our church who would have described herself as an atheist just a few years ago. She ended up also, as a teenager, depressed and experimenting, let me put this politely, experimenting with lifestyles that were not going to do her any good.
Yes.
And then through some internet message board, she met a Christian, and they started to meet up. And what she saw in his life made her realize that there was a goodness in Christianity, that she left her atheism behind, but it wasn't through a carefully worked argument of any kind. It was seeing the goodness of a Christian life lived out, and then through that being willing again to come to church and seeing there's like a whole community of people like this who have good lives. And she describes it as being like the lights coming on and all of the heaviness of her depression falling away. And it became the most obvious thing in the world for her to become a Christian. She got baptized, and she's now helping lead our youth group.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's really good.
What was the other question?
Any
books.
Any books? Yeah, any easy to read, accessible books.
The book that I've been recommending recently is a book called Confronting. I think it's called. Let me just check. Since I'm online, I can check. It's called Confronting Christianity, and it's about 12 questions that by a woman called Rebecca McLaughlin. It goes through, I think, 12 questions that get aggressively asked of Christians in these days, around what we have to say about sexuality and gender and the Bible and other religions. And she is a really good writer and really solid in what she has to say. Whether, if anyone picks that up and thinks actually it's a little bit, we say layman, I don't know kind of what sort of level to pitch things at. She's an academic, but she's writing for everybody. I think that's probably about right. If anybody wants anything either that's more academic or less academic than that, then do let me know and I'll see what other suggestions I can come up with.
Yeah. So Confronting Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin.
Yeah. If you Google Confronting Christianity, it'll come up straight away. Anything by Tim Keller. I don't know if you've come across Tim Keller.
Yeah.
He's written so many books. Whichever one of those is closest to your current questions, I go with. He's brilliant.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I'm just so grateful, Steve, for your time.
It's really wonderful to be with you.
Really appreciate the time you've taken to be with us. These 2 sessions, just to help us to explore this. I think what I've come away with is saying, just you don't have to answer everything, and you haven't got the answers for everything, and just to resist the temptation to want to defend and to sort of try and come up with a quick rationale of something, especially when you asked about something that you may not have that specific knowledge base about that area. You're just a Christian following God and following Christ. And on one sense, that's good enough, even if it will make you look silly. On one sense, that's good enough. And to learn how to just be a good example, to learn to follow Christ publicly and privately, not having what you're doing privately and what is public are 2 different things.
Let it shine.
That's been really helpful, Steve. Much appreciated.
Good. You've got a birthday meal, I understand, still ahead of you.
So I've got a meal ahead of me. Yes, I do have indeed. Yeah. But I hope we can find opportunities again. We can give you warnings well in advance, just for you to spare some evenings or Sundays.
Would love to do that. And I mean, it's just to be clear, it's really good for me as well. It enriches me to be asked questions that are coming from a slightly different experience of life. People have lived in different countries, and it brings a freshness, forces me to think afresh, and that does me good.
Thank you very much, Steve. Should we just pray and then we can call it an evening? Father, we thank you for your goodness. Thank you that you're a God who loves all of us and you care for all of us. And we thank you that we have got the privilege of being called your sons and daughters. And Lord, would you help us to shine your light to our family members, to our work colleagues, to our fellow students in university and in school, that they may see our good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven. Just thank you for the time that Steve has taken to talk to us and help us to just navigate through these waters of understanding and dealing and responding in love to people who have questions about our faith. Lord, may you help us to hold our tongues when we need to listen. Help us to pray for people and care for them when the urge to condemn and criticize is there. And Lord, help us through experiences with people like that to deepen our faith and to help us to deepen our understanding of our knowledge of you. Amen.
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 Fantastic.
Thank you.
That's it, guys. We will end the broadcast here, but it was such a delight for you to join us. If you still want to watch this again and send any questions, you can always send them to us. And Steve might try to get hold of you or send back a response. We never know. But God bless you. Have a nice evening.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
What do you mean?